Hi, I unfortunately forgot to record uh, the bit that we went over in terms of vaccines. So I started out with the idea that not all ideas have equal merit, and I used the example of gravity, and I said in the beginning of the class when we were looking at scientific method that hypotheses were kind of a dime a dozen, and that, let's say for gravity, why things don't go flying off into space, that the reason for that is because there are these little metal heads in the center of the Earth that set up a magnetic field, and that causes everything to stay and not fly off. That's the cause of gravity. And then I said, of course, that okay, what prediction does that make? And the prediction is that okay, nothing should fly off into space. And if we actually ran the experiment, we would find out that the only thing that stays where they are metal objects, iron objects, and that everything else floats off. So without even doing the experiment, we can actually dismiss that or refute that hypothesis. And then I told you a little bit about different theories of gravity, Newtonian gravity, and then, of course, Einstein's general theory of relativity that incorporated gravity and how mass actually affects gravity. And I said, we know, of course, that at this point, that the metalhead idea never had any merit, and we don't even speak about it anymore because there's no reason to. It's foolish. It has nothing to do with reality. Whereas if we really want to talk about gravity, we go to general relativity to explain it and how mass warps the fabric of the universe and the fabric of space-time. Okay. Now, as that was an introduction to the idea of vaccines, childhood vaccines, and the relationship to childhood vaccines to autism. This idea was first published, or actually, yeah, it was actually published by a physician in England or in Great Britain. Somehow it got published, even though it was absolutely a terrible study and didn't show anything of the sort in terms of childhood vaccines causing autism. And in fact, eventually it was retracted from that journal, and I forget which one it is. It was the big medical journal from Great Britain. Anyway, a very big medical journal. And subsequently, there were other articles were published showing that, in fact, there is absolutely no, well, first of all, it was foolish to show that childhood vaccines cause autism. They had no data. All they had really was an association and a correlation. So I asked the class, what is a correlation? And someone said, I forget who it was, said a correlation is an association between two different things. And then I asked, does correlation mean causation? And everybody answered no. So I then talked about how childhood vaccines happen at the same time that autism generally shows up. Now, why is that? Many times in nature, if something shows up at the same time period, and then other things show up at the same time period, there might be a signal there that one causes the other. So the thing is, childhood vaccines happen in childhood, early childhood for that matter, usually a few months after birth. And autism also shows up, but usually autism doesn't show up until about, a year later, a year old, or a year and a half old, 18 months. Okay, so it was thought, because of this article, people were misled that childhood vaccines cause autism. Furthermore, another student mentioned that childhood vaccines have mercury in them to keep them, fresh and not degrade. And that used to be the case, but it's not anymore. And actually, the form of mercury that was in vaccines was not reactive, like the kind of mercury that can cause mercury poisoning and all sorts of problems, including severe neurological problems and developmental neurological problems. So, vaccines, but because vaccines and autism happen and kind of at the same time, there's been this continuing belief that childhood vaccines, either because of the vaccines themselves or because of the things that are in the vaccines, cause autism. Now, there was a huge measles epidemic last year that started at Disneyland. They're not exactly sure who the individual zero was that started it. And then a lot of people at Disneyland subsequently caught it because measles is highly transmissible. And then further, they found other cases in other states because some of those people who were at Disneyland in California then went back home. And before it was over, there were 100 and something cases of measles. And just so you know, measles is a highly transmissible disease. It's about 90%. So one of the things that makes an infectious disease transmissible is how it's transmitted. And it turns out measles is transmitted through the air, through breathing. So people breathe out viral particles. Other people breathe them in. You don't need very many to start the infection, and then they eventually show full-blown measles. And of course, we use the vaccines for one reason, and that's to provide immunity to measles. We also use a combination vaccine that provides not only immunity to measles, but to whooping cough, to diphtheria, to mumps, a whole number of childhood diseases, usually diseases that happen in childhood, and that provide what's called herd immunity. So if you have a population of people, and let's say 95% or even 90% are vaccinated, it's very unlikely that a person with measles will transmit it to another person who is not vaccinated and is immune to measles, right? And so before it can get started on a chain reaction, since it's highly transmissible, every other person that comes into contact with us, that person already has immunity because of the vaccine. Now, the anti-vax group said, well, it should be a choice of whether we should vaccinate our children or not, and we would rather not because of the association with autism, even though there is no association. And in fact, since This first paper was published and then eventually, not that long after, retracted. There have been further studies that show unequivocally, that means without a doubt, that childhood vaccines have no causative effect whatsoever in causing autism. Now, there have also been charges that are actually true that some vaccines can actually cause the disease that they are supposedly there to prevent. In other words, prevent a person from getting. And the best known one is actually polio. Now, polio is almost been eradicated. It's still endemic. That means it's still in epidemic proportions in Pakistan. There have been a few cases, I think, somewhere in Africa, and then there were a recent case or two in Ukraine. I'm not sure how the Ukrainian case started, because it only could have come from another person who had either been from the African population or from Pakistan. And the African population was very small in terms of individuals who had polio, because polio has almost eradicated it there, because the vaccination problem was very, very successful. And probably in the next year, the endemic polio in Africa will be completely gone. Unfortunately, in Pakistan and also in Afghanistan, the Taliban are there, and anybody who's tried to provide vaccines for immunity and vaccinating the whole population has often been captured by the Taliban and put to death. That this is a huge Western conspiracy to control Pakistanis. So because of that, Pakistan, because of the Taliban and the lack of immunity, polio is still prevalent in Pakistan. Furthermore, there are occasionally people who get the vaccine for polio, and the polio vaccine is actually a live virus that has been really weakened. Well, occasionally, perhaps 1 in 100,000 or 500,000 people who get this weakened vaccine, the weakened virus, actually, once they take it, it actually, some of the viral particles actually eventually turn into or are changed into not just weakened virus, but full-strength virus that then goes on to subsequently make those people actually get polio, which is terrible. But like I said, it only is like 1 in 500,000 people, so it's very rare, but it does happen. No doubt about that. The thing is, if you actually look at the problems that polio causes, not only does it cause death, but it also completely paralyzes people so that they can never walk again. They can't breathe without a respirator. It's a terrible disease. And so having immunity protects far more many people than from polio than the one person in every 500,000 people who's had the vaccine. So even though there's a chance, a very, very small one, the greater chance is that a person will get polio from another person. Okay. Now, this all has to do with the ideas of merit. We talked about the merit of different explanations or hypotheses for gravity. The metalhead hypothesis, we'll call it, has absolutely no merit. It falls apart on the face of it without even actually doing any experiment, because you can see that our keys or anything metal of course, doesn't float off, but everything else should float off and doesn't either, so it can't be the actual cause. Well, the vaccine causing autism is the same thing. It has it has completely no merit whatsoever. Nor does the vaccine now have any mercury that's been taken out, even though it didn't cause any problems anyway. So there is absolutely no link between a vaccine, childhood vaccine, and actually and getting autism. There is a link between getting a vaccine and getting protected against childhood diseases. And that link has been firmly established, and it works incredibly well for all of these childhood diseases. Usually, once you get a vaccine for any of these diseases, whether it's mumps, they're all kind, or whooping cough, or measles, or diphtheria, tetanus is another one that usually lasts a lifetime. Okay, now, so pretty much before this whole autism thing came along, almost all children were vaccinated. And in some states, it's mandatory for kids to get vaccinated. In fact, it's the states where some of the most conservative states, I think Kentucky and Tennessee, where it's mandatory. Alabama too, maybe. It's also now mandatory in California, but that was because before it wasn't. You could get a waiver if because of ideas, whether it's religious or not. Well, that's no longer the case. All children who want to go to school must get vaccinated, or they won't be allowed in. So, the primary reason, of course, vaccination is to prevent children from getting it. And there are always going to be, there's usually some children who have immune problems with their latent immunity. They are like the bubble baby, they have a genetic problem. There are other people who, not necessarily children, who have immunosuppression, either because they have leukemia or some other reason and are susceptible. But they can't take vaccines. Vaccines for them cause problems. So they have to go without vaccines. Unfortunately, if there isn't herd immunity, and someone actually has that disease and then transmits transfers it to someone else with an immune system that's compromised, they're likely to get it and also to get very, very sick, and it might even kill them. So those people actually rely on herd immunity. Without that, they would be at high risk. So one reason, of course, to get all children vaccinated is to protect other people. Now, you could say, well, I don't want my kid vaccinated and protected. I think it's too dangerous because of autism. Unfortunately, unless you keep your kid completely away from anybody else, you do have a certain responsibility in terms of having your kid infect other people. And so you really shouldn't be allowed to go to any school with other children. Because there might be kids there that have immune compromised systems. Now, let's say, okay, that's fine. That means those kids just can't go to school. Well, there's obviously parents who don't like that. But a lot of those kids are homeschooled, let's say. So, now in addition to herd immunity, there have been some recent studies that show that, in fact, the vaccine not only protects kids against catching measles, but that actually getting measles, most people who get measles in the United States don't get very sick. They get spots all over, they have a fever, respiratory stuff, and then they're over it within a week. Some kids or some people get measles and they have much worse symptoms. And if you go outside the country, there's a certain number of measles cases where the children die, or the people who get measles actually die. Or they get very sick and they end up actually with some neurological problems because they get brain swelling and things like that. Now, there's another problem that measles actually causes. So besides causing these normal symptoms that for the majority of people aren't very serious, and you might say, well, then I don't really need the vaccine. It turns out that measles also is an immunosuppressive virus. That means people who get measles afterwards have a suppressed immune system, and it works like this. We have an adaptive immune system. We also have a kind of a latent immune system. We won't talk about that, but the adaptive one is as we get some adaptive immunity from our mothers because of we actually share some of her immune cells that have already been trained by being exposed previously to any sort of viruses or bacteria or single-cell mold and fungi and things like that. And then, over time, kids, usually within the first year, their immune system starts developing because they're being exposed to all sorts of different things. And it actually trains the immune system. So usually what happens is when a person is first exposed to a new disease, they have no immunity to it. It takes a while, but the immune system begins to recognize it and then produces antibodies that glom onto the particle, the viral particles or the bacteria or whatever, and those things are now marked and they can't infect anything else, and these T cells or immune system cells come along and kill them. At the same time, the memory of the chemical memory of what these infectious microbes are actually, the memory of it in the immune system is held in another cell called the B cell. It's another white blood cell and also another variety of a T cell. So both of these actually carry the memory of previous infections. And so when a person then is exposed again to the same infection, instead of having to wait for the immune system to learn what it is and then create antibodies, it can start creating antibodies right away before a disease has a chance to actually show any symptoms in a person. So Ebola disease, that was happening in Africa, is the perfect example. By the time the immune system, for most people, was able to then suppress it, they were so sick that they died. Okay. Now, one might think with the measles vaccine, or with the measles, the disease itself, okay, it suppresses it, but it was usually thought that it only suppresses or wipes out these memory cells for a couple of weeks. Well, they did a correlative study. Here we are with correlation again. In Great Britain and I think in the United States, I'm going to post it online, on Moodle, for you guys to look at it. And it shows a correlation that obviously if you get the measles vaccine, you don't get measles. If you don't have the measles vaccine and you actually get measles, it has demonstrated that you're much more likely to actually get another disease and that this disease you were probably exposed to before, but your immune system memory cells have been wiped out, and that there's actually an increase in morbidity. That means harm from a microbe, or mortality, death from a microbe. So it seems to be that people who didn't get the vaccine but actually got measles has a higher incidence of mortality than individuals who never got measles, either because they never were infected or they got the vaccine that protected them. And that this was actually significantly different in terms of mortality. So, by not having a child vaccinated, they not only could get measles, but then they have a higher chance of actually getting measles and then suffering all these secondary infections that would normally not have caused any problem because of your immune system that started to recognize them, but the memory of the immune system has wiped those out, and so the immune system has to start from scratch. So I would say to people who say, well, I don't want my kids to get autism, I would say, well, you're actually placing your kid at risk, not only from measles, but from a much higher incidence of mortality from these other diseases that normally you would have already been protected from. Now, I said it's a correlation because they had a big data set and they showed that there was this association. If we wanted to actually test this, we would say, okay, you have two groups. You have a group that's been immunized or had a vaccine for measles, or you give a vaccine for measles to prevent measles. You have another group that's unvaccinated for measles, and then you have another group that is unvaccinated and actually exposed to measles. And then you actually follow this group over, let's say, a number of years. And then you would predict, of course, that if you have the unvaccinated group that's never exposed to measles, you don't expect anything to happen. You have the vaccinated group that can't get measles. You would expect no incidence from other diseases that kids might have been exposed to. And then you have the third group that was not immunized. They're exposed to measles, and the prediction would be, of course, that it wipes out their memory cells, and then infections that they had been exposed to previously, their immune system no longer recognizes it, and they're at risk from those infections again. And so you have concurrent increases in either harm from the disease or mortality. Of course, we can't really do that with ethically. So, but there's a lot of ways of actually showing that the correlation is actually very, very strong, and that there's a preponderance of evidence that suggests, in fact, that getting measles causes these extra mortalities above and beyond what would normally occur. Okay, so I just want to make sure you understand that. So when someone comes along and says autism, there are two reasons. One is for all those around you, and two, for yourself. Because if you get exposed to measles, it's likely that your immune systems, some of the memory cells will get wiped out, and you will be, in a sense, immunocompromised to infections that you previously had and wouldn't have any problems in the future, and that you could get those diseases again and perhaps get very sick or even die from them. Okay. Okay, so we're back to evolution. Forces of evolution. I didn't really cover this. I didn't get it recorded, so we'll start with it. Well, the first force of evolution that we've talked about a little bit is natural selection. Natural selection provides, or evolution by natural selection is is the environment that actually selects or imposes selection on organisms and traits, and if some traits lead to better survival and or reproduction, then those traits are passed on to future generations at a much higher rate than traits that don't do as well. And so future generations will eventually look more like those ancestors that had the traits that were adaptive. Okay, now, there's a difference between natural selection and evolution by natural selection. You can have natural selection that doesn't cause evolution whatsoever. A good example might be the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. Natural selection usually works on things in an environment that an animal, or an organism rather, is likely to encounter over and over and over again. So those with traits that favor it, that help it survive and or reproduce. There's selection remaining that maintains that trait and doesn't let other traits come in that aren't as good. Okay, so with dinosaurs, there's really nothing there that will necessarily, there's no trait that will, in a sense, protect you from asteroids. Asteroids' impacts on Earth don't happen very often. The dinosaur impact was 65 million years ago, or the asteroid impact for the dinosaurs was 65 million years ago. Now, there have been other asteroid impacts or impacts from meteors since then, but nothing of that size, and nothing that had that kind of an effect. Now, of course, someone mentioned in the class that, well, perhaps animals that during the dinosaurs that were actually able to burrow into the ground and hide might have been more likely to survive than others. And that's a great point that person made. And in fact, it very well likely might be true. But in terms of, in this case, it basically the whole population had that same trait of actually being able to burrow into the ground and hiding out and spending a lot of time underground, and perhaps being protected at least if you're a distance from where the asteroid, let's say, struck, which is the Yucatan Peninsula. And so we can say that's actually species selection. In other words, all members of the species, because of their lifestyle, were, at least if they were a certain distance away, were more likely to survive than other species, let's say like dinosaurs, which didn't burrow into the ground. They were too large for the most part and didn't survive. And so the organisms that then did survive made it through the extinction period. They then diversified. We had mostly mammals and other things that did this. Okay. Now, there were also birds that made it through, and there's a good chance that they made it through the extinction event because they could fly. But it's not entirely sure. That's just it's a hypothesis, but it hasn't been, actually. There's not a whole lot of evidence. There's some evidence, but not a whole lot of evidence. So you can actually have natural selection that has no effect on evolution because the selective agent is essentially random and is not really part of the natural environment continuously. Now, before you can actually have natural selection, you also actually need mutation, because natural selection requires variation in the population. I mention this because previously I showed you the ladder of of life, or the ladder of things in the world, starting at stone, all the way up to plants, animals, humans, and then God. That was the view. And that animals and plants and all these other things that were created by God were created perfectly, including humans, and humans were, of course, created in the image of God. Okay. Now, in that view, there would have been no variation among different organisms whatsoever, and so if they all had the same traits, no variation among them, there couldn't be any evolution. The only way evolution can happen is if there's some variation, and the basis for most variation in traits is genetic mutation, where there's a mutation in the DNA. Now, DNA codes for proteins, not for traits. The proteins are then, in a sense, expressed as part of our phenotype. So our phenotype is our anatomy, our physiology, our behavior, how we develop as organisms. All these things that are part of our physical self, including how we think. So that's the basis. Mutation, the genetic change, is actually the basis for it, but the genetic change only changes the proteins and how much are made and the kind of different proteins that are made. And then that eventually, during development, is actually expressed in terms of the phenotype. I just want you to understand that. So the basis for variation also provides the basis for evolution by natural selection. Now, you can have mutation without natural selection, and it will actually change the population. It will just do it very, very slowly because mutations are rare. They don't happen very often. Most mutations either have no effect or very little effect, or they might be deleterious. That means they actually lower an individual's ability to survive, and they won't live long enough to actually pass on their genes. Okay. And then genetic drift also relates to this, because genetic drift has to do with how likely it is that, let's say, a mutation will increase in frequency or decrease in frequency in a population, depending on the population size. We'll go into this more, but just quickly, if you have a population size of, let's say, 10 million, and you have a mutation, or let's say you have an allele that's in a frequency of 1 in 10 million. Very, very, very low frequency, right? Compared to a population of, let's say, only size 10. Now, if we let all these members in each population reproduce, there will be 10 million new individuals in the 10 million size population, and there will be 10 new individuals in the size 10 population. Well, if the individual with a mutation in the 10 million reproduces, let's say the mutation rate was a little higher, you'd have a better chance of that not being wiped out of the population, because it'll be like either getting the mutation or not is a 50-50 chance. And if you were to flip a coin 10 million times, and you had this mutation, there's a 50% chance it will be replicated again and passed on, or there's a 50% chance that it won't. The trouble is, with a very small population, you have, let's say, one individual who has a mutation, and all the other 9 individuals in the population don't have the mutation. So what's the frequency or the percentage of individuals in the population size 10? It's now 10% instead of 1 over 10 million. So if you were to reproduce and you flip the coin of the individual with the mutation, they would either they would either produce an individual that had the mutation or didn't. Okay? So if you were to flip these coins, you might actually, instead of getting 5 heads and 5 tails, or 9 heads and 1 tail, tail is a mutation, you might actually get 6 heads and 4 tails, or 9 heads or 10 heads and no tails, or 8 heads and 2 tails, or even less probably 7 heads and 3 tails, right? So you could actually increase the number of the mutation in the population. It's much more likely, it's a matter of 10% each time you flip, for each individual flip. Okay? So it's much more likely that genetic drift, which affects the population, the number of mutations or the frequency of mutations in a population, randomly, not like natural selection. Natural selection actually is adaptive, and it's not a random draw of mutations, because mutations that actually confer an advantage are more likely to be passed on to future generations in natural selection, whereas, or evolution by natural selection, whereas that's not the case whatsoever with genetic drift. It's strictly a random process. Furthermore, genetic drift is very, very weak in large populations, as I kind of explained in terms of the degree of a percentage of change between small populations and large populations. So genetic drift has very little effect on mutations in what is called a very large population or an infinitely large population. Now, we don't have infinitely large populations in the universe, but once you have a population beyond a certain size, it almost acts as if it's an infinitely large population. So drift is a very weak force in large populations. Unfortunately, it's a very strong force in populations that are very small. Now, which leads us to the next thing. You can have either random mating among all individuals in a population, or you can have, we'll say, non-random mating. A good example of non-random mating, we'll look at that more closely later, a little bit later on, but for example, the royals in Europe previously, or the royal kings and stuff in Egypt, they generally married close relatives because of their royal blood. Unfortunately for them, when individuals mate who are closely related, if they both have inherited, let's say, a mutation that is, let's not say bad because of one copy, but of 2 copies of it, one from mom, one from dad, they're more likely to express that and have lower fitness. So we tend to see in those kinds of situations where there's non-random mating, where individuals marry relatives, that there's a higher incidence of genetic problems, usually recessive genetic mutations that cause disease and lower fitness. And we see this kinds of incidence of things in both the Egyptians, in terms of we look at the bones of those individuals, and Europeans, because we've actually got historical records of, so-and-so had color blindness, which is only found on the male line because it's a sex-linked trait, or other things that made these royals, because they had these mutations and they inherited a copy from both, that it lowered their fitness too. So another one was hemophiliacs, also a sex-linked trait. A number of different things, and then there were some that affected all royals. So this non-random mating actually caused lots of problems. Okay. And then finally, the last force of evolution is migration, or gene flow. So you can change. Now remember, the change, evolution happens in a change in the allele frequencies or the traits in a population over time. So each of these forces can actually change these allele frequencies, or they're eventually the traits. So migration is the same thing. Migration, you can have two different populations of the same species, and there might be new alleles or different alleles, and an allele is a different version of a gene. Individuals might disperse from one population to another and bring in these new alleles, and of course that will then change the frequencies in the population that received the new alleles. First of all, they'll have more diversity, but also there will now be perhaps there will be less frequent, lower frequency in some of the alleles that they had before. Or members of a population can disperse away from the population and then change the frequency as well. And in fact, let's say only a small percentage, a few individuals actually disperse from one large population, let's say to an island, and start a new population. It's very likely that the alleles they carry are not all the alleles. So we're going to get into that as well. So those are the forces of evolution. Okay, here's natural selection. Okay, we're going to first start with Darwin's first great idea, evolution by natural selection. And we're going to get into how evolution by natural selection actually works. The question is, where did Darwin get this great idea for evolution by natural selection? Well, first of all, he went on a vacation. Actually, he was the naturalist on a voyage called the Voyage of the Beagle around the world. And this voyage was an exploration voyage, and also a way to project English empire power. And Darwin's job on the voyage was to collect specimens and then bring them back to Great Britain, including not only just living specimens or dead specimens that used to be living, but also different kinds of minerals and fossils and things like that. Okay, so he had all this new stuff that he later used to understand how evolution by natural selection might actually happen. Furthermore, Darwin was part of the landed gentry. He was a gentleman. Gentlemen in early 19th century to middle 19th, all the way into the 20th century, these are aristocratic individuals or individuals with lots of money. They didn't have to work. However, it was kind of looked down upon if you just had someone who didn't work whatsoever. So Darwin had a big intellect, and there was a thought that he might at one point become a vicar. For some reason, because you had to do something, a lot of aristocrats became vicars, which are kind of like priests in the Anglican Church. But he carried on his naturalist stuff And one of the things he did was captive breeding, where he actually bred, let's say, pigeons to have different traits. This is called artificial selection. I think he also did it with some plants, but he also knew lots of people who bred various, let's say, different kinds of corn or wheat or tomatoes or whatever, or obviously different kinds of animals, like different kinds of pigs, pigs with certain traits versus not others, or dogs, obviously. That's another one he used. Okay, now, so we'll go on. It turns out, hold on, the next thing you're going to see is this idea of variation. Because variation is one of the things that that it's necessary to have for a population to actually evolve. The first idea for Darwin was essentially selective breeding, artificial selection. Being a gentleman in the upper class and aristocracy in Great Britain in the early to middle 1800s, as a gentleman he didn't have to work. But it was usually assumed that that everybody would do something. Now, of course, there were always dandies about, let's say, guys who they didn't want to work. All they wanted to do was have fun and have lots of sex. In the 17th century, there's a guy named Lord Rochester who was like that. He eventually died of syphilis in his 30s, but he was actually a great writer, especially poet. And his poetry mainly had to do with absolutely wild, crazy ideas about sex. In fact, it's really some of the funniest stuff I've ever read. Okay, but Darwin wasn't like that. And he, in fact, he actually bred, not only did he breed pigeons, right here, but he also bred, I think he did some selective breeding with some plants as well. Okay? Now, so we got the idea, well, he made the inference from, if we select for these traits in, let's say, dogs, over time the population will change over time due to, we'll say, artificial selection, even though it's selection, no matter what. He then made the inference that if the environment is different, the environment is almost acting like an artificial agent, but it changes, the environment is likely to change, let's say, randomly. And those changing environments also select for traits that increase in frequency because they're favored versus not. And in fact, if you remember before, before we looked at the ladder of life, how people thought about a hierarchy of things previously, there was this idea of typology, like there's a perfect species, or an individual in a species is perfect because God made it that way. Well, it turns out, of course, that's not happening like that, and it's a good thing because if you didn't have variation in traits, selection wouldn't be able to work on it. If they're all, let's say you have an arm, or let's say height, everybody in here with the same exact height. In the current environment, let's say it's fine. This height is perfect. But let's say the environment changed, and outer space aliens came in, and they decided to use humans as food. Like, what was the H.G. Wells thing from Invasion from Mars? Okay, and the thing is, these aliens were a new selective agent. They've changed the environment. The aliens like big people because there's more nutrition there. Also, it turns out that small people can hide more easily from the aliens. So what do you think is going to happen in terms of the population, in terms of the frequency of different sizes?
Big people will die and the small people.
Right. Now, what happens if everybody was the same size?
Everyone will die.
Yeah. Did you get that? If there was no variation and the aliens were the selective agent, everyone would die. But if there was variation between small and large, then the aliens would eat the big ones and the medium-sized ones, the little ones would get away. And if, in fact, size is heritable, you inherit it from your mother and father, then those would then become much higher proportion of the population because they could survive better. They still might eventually get picked off by aliens because all of a sudden no big ones anymore. You know, it's kind of like the fisheries industry. There used to be, let's say, these bluefin tuna that went up to 1,000 pounds or even larger. There's very, very, very few of them left because humans like bigger bluefin tuna and smaller ones. And also, it takes longer to grow one that large, and so usually fish are caught before they can reach that age. Well, the same thing is happening with these aliens. So now you have small individuals who, they might still be picked off, but there's a population that is safe for the most part, that they can continue reproducing and not going extinct. And the same thing has happened with bluefin tuna. The population now is much smaller than it used to be. Okay, so I mentioned selection is an unfortunate choice of words. If I could, I'd go back and talk to Darwin. Selection kind of implies, unfortunately, that that there's an agent, we'll say something with intelligence or something with an ability to choose that's actually selecting one thing for another. But that's not the case. The environment, depending on the environment, either favors certain alleles or traits and disfavors others. The ones that are favored increase in population. If the environment changes again, it might go back to what it was or to a new alleles. But it's not like the environment is actually thinking. Nor do organisms change because it'd be better if they changed. There's a reason pigs don't fly. In fact, there's a reason I don't fly. I would love to be able to fly. Anybody in here would like to fly? Right? Instead of getting in a plane or whatever? Yeah, right. Everybody. Okay. I would love to fly. In fact, I actually think flying would probably increase my fitness substantially. Unless I got hit by a jet or something. Right? Okay. Now, I really, really, really want to fly. Am I going to evolve wings? No. No matter how much I want to be like that, there's nothing I can do. Now, I could change my size. I could put myself on a Spanish rack and they could stretch me until suddenly, instead of being my size, I'm, 10 feet tall. I probably wouldn't be feeling very good after the rack, though, I can assure you. Or I could wear shoes that make me taller. But my actual size has really not changed whatsoever. So selection is just the environment. So evolution by natural selection, again, is any consistent difference in survival and reproduction among genotypically, that means the alleles that they have, or phenotypically, their anatomy, physiology, everything that makes up an organism, differ, are phenotypically different classes of organisms within a population. That means there might be individuals with a certain trait that allow them to survive better, or reproduce better, or both. Now, obviously, it has to be both. If it's survival, that's naturally going to then necessarily lead to better reproduction, because if you don't live long enough, you can't reproduce. But it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to reproduce. That's why we have something called fitness. And fitness is not going to the gym, nor is it the strongest. Remember about the aliens. Which phenotype had the higher fitness? Large individuals or small individuals? Okay, right? They're not necessarily stronger than the big guys. They might be able to fight the aliens better, but the aliens are so big and strong that it's meaningless to them. So in that case, the only thing that's actually favoring survival is being small and being able to hide. Now, among that population who can survive, the small ones, there's probably just a subset that are actually going to breed successfully. Okay? So, survival and fitness is a matter of survival and reproduction, and/or reproduction. Okay. Okay, natural selection is the modifying force. If you guys know what a sieve is, where you put material in it and certain things fall through and other things stay on the top. That's how natural selection works. It lets certain things through, and then what's left on top is, we'll say, the better phenotype. So, for example, when we go out and we sieve soil and we try to get gold out of it, it turns out gold is heavier. It's a very heavy element compared to a lot of the other stuff there. It sinks, and it usually, also, it's in a pan, so it's not much of a sieve, but you could have very small particles. But it sinks, and all the other stuff gets washed out. Same sort of thing. So all selection does is act like a sieve, where certain sizes or certain weights or whatever the trait is are the ones that are favored and left over, and the rest get washed out. Natural selection, this sorting, is the only thing that actually modifies traits in an adaptive way, making individual organisms with the traits more likely to survive and/or reproduce. You can also obviously have selection against, it does just the opposite, or you might have very relaxed selection where it doesn't do much of anything. So adaptations, any trait that increases an individual's ability to survive and/or reproduce. And fitness, an individual's ability to survive and reproduce, that depends on the traits that they have. In other words, do they have adaptive traits that increase their fitness, or do they have traits that are, let's say, not quite as good as everybody else? And in terms of fitness, the bottom line is how much is the individual contributing to the next generation. Those that contribute more of their alleles to future generations have higher fitness relative to individuals who don't. In other words, those individuals with traits or trait variants that are actually adaptive, that increase their survival and reproduction, will leave more offspring and hence more of their own alleles that are passed from generation to generation in the future offspring. Just like the the population of small people after the aliens come and eat up everybody else. So here's a bunch of different kinds of adaptations. Camouflage. This is some kind of viper. I'm not sure which. It could be I don't see it might be a rattlesnake, or it might be some other pit viper. The population has evolved patterns on the skin that make it blend in with the leaves. That's why they're not conspicuous. And it turns out being not conspicuous is great for eating prey, because they'll just sit there until prey comes along that don't see them, and they'll easily get the prey because the prey never quite understands that there's a snake in the area. You can also have traits that are adaptive in that they increase an individual's ability to survive and reproduce because of competition. So in this case, the taller giraffe might have an advantage over the smaller giraffe. There's obviously variation here. It's also, it turns out, that larger males are more likely to get to mate with females who are smaller than smaller males. They can actually use their necks as like a weapon and bash each other, and then one runs away. Okay. This is more camouflage. It's an insect that looks like a leaf. Same here. Polar bears, well, camouflage, but also it turns out it affects their thermal balance in terms of how hot and how cold they get. Being white actually, you would think it would radiate heat out, but it doesn't. It actually increases the amount of radiation and the heat that they can utilize. Okay? Now, there could be other traits that are, of course, well, like the giraffe, that are sexually selected, where certain individuals are more likely to breed than others. Okay, we're going to end on this one, but just to think about it, here we're back to the idea of what's a natural selection and what is not selection. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection? Okay. If you get the girl and I don't, is that selection? Okay. That'll affect your reproduction, right? If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection?
Yes.
Yes. Same thing is happening, whether it's a lion or me bopping you on the head. If a pine cone hits you on the head and kills you, is that natural selection? Yes. Do you think it would lead to evolution by natural selection? Let's say a pine cone hitting you on the head is a random thing that is not a consistent selective force.
No.
So in this case, you can have selection, but not necessarily evolution by natural selection. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? It is. It's still now, and it might even affect your phenotype. In fact, it probably does. Some individuals are less likely to get hit by a bus than others, right? Some people drink too much and they stumble in front of a bus, and that's the end of them. Other individuals don't drink so much, or are more wary of buses because they saw that drunken asshole get run over by a bus, and they say, I better watch out for buses. Okay. And then, is there a difference between natural selection and evolution by natural selection?
Yes.
Okay. Natural selection can be anything that affects whether you can survive or reproduce. Evolution by natural selection only happens if you have a trait that increases your ability to survive and reproduce. So, if getting hit on the head by a pine cone is, let's say you're just plain unlucky, that individuals in the population getting hit on the head by a pine cone is almost random, then there's really not going to be any change in pine cone deaths. Now, it could be that some people like to hang out under pine trees and other people don't like to hang out under the pine trees. Then you would actually have evolution by natural selection, because now pine cones falling on your head, you're more likely to get hit on the head if you hang out underneath pine trees all the time versus not. And eventually you might have a population that avoids pine trees or has big bony plates on their head. Okay. And that's it. Thanks.
Are we going to have a test next week?
We'll see how far we get. I don't think so. I think I'll put it up, but it looks like not. Will be the week after.
Are you putting that last question, the vestigial trait question, on top of that?
Yeah. Well, we haven't really got to that yet. But we will. Okay. I just want to make sure that a little later on we're going to look at ancestry, and which you kind of had in the film, but I just want to make sure you actually understand it to answer the question.
Okay.
Next week is basically just a lecture because I won't be able to be here next week.
Okay. This is being taped.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and next week will be taped